Well, councillors, I'll declare the meeting open and welcome you to this special meeting of the Toowoomba Regional Council. This meeting, of course, is open to the public and will also be live streamed. I would like to thank all those in the room and acknowledge those who are watching us via Council's social media channels. But can I recognise the CEO, the General Manager, all of you, my council colleagues. Thank you very much for being here. I acknowledge the Aboriginal parties whose songlines traverse the lands we meet on today, the Western Waka Waka, the Gibel and Jarrawa people, and can I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the knowledge and rich traditions and bold ambitions of Australia's first people. We have an apology that's been recorded from Councillor Carl. No other matters? No apologies? No declarations of interest? If not, we are today talking about the Toowoomba's region's futures and particularly around bushfire risk analysis. And this meeting, outcome of this meeting, will put us on the pathway to analysing that for future urban development. So I think we then move to item 3, which is suspension of standing orders. Would someone like to move accordingly? Councillor Von Hoff and Councillor Carol Taylor. Those in favour? That's carried. My pleasure now to introduce Heath, who will lead the discussion today.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and good afternoon, councillors. Through the Toowoomba Region Futures Program, Council is developing a plan that will assist us to manage growth and change across the Toowoomba region over the next 30 years. It'll help us realise the opportunities that are before us as a community and overcome the challenges that are facing us. It'll shape the places where we live, work and play so that it supports the lifestyle that we desire and maintain the things that we value as a community. We are currently undertaking 12 studies as the first stage of that program. Those studies will inform the development of the new planning scheme and a new infrastructure plan. The Bushfire Study is an important part of that suite of studies. It's being done so that we understand where bushfire risk is present within our region and so that we can put in place measures to make sure that people and property at risk are adequately protected. The study is fairly well advanced and we're at a point in the process where we need some direction from Council to enable us to move forward and to finalise that work. Laura Gannon and Julie Brooke are here from Meridian Urban. They're undertaking this study. They are specialists within this field and they're going to take you through the material that you'll need to consider to be able to provide us the needed direction. So I'll hand over to Laura. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Can I just apologise for not having introduced them, but we, as Heath has so rightly said, we've got Laura Gannon and Julie Brooke here from Meridian Planning in Brisbane who've been doing a lot of work. So Laura, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Thank you, councillors, for having me today. I'll just wait for our presentation to load. Oh,
you've turned it on. That's it.
As per introductions, my name's Laura Gannon. I'm a land use planner by background. I have 17 years of experience for the past 10 years, I have been specialising in the integration of bushfire risk into land use planning policy and strategy. I hold a graduate diploma from the University of Western Sydney in bushfire protection. I've also studied with the former Emergency Management Institute in Victoria, as well as bushfire coursework with the University of Technology in Sydney. So today I am here to discuss the work that we have been underway with for Council in terms of the preparation of a bushfire risk analysis for the region. The purpose of today's discussion, acknowledging that we are still underway with this work, it is not yet complete, is to talk to the purpose of the work and seek direction from Council on the preferred approach to regulating development in bushfire-prone areas. So today's focus is really on future development and future risk rather than existing risk, but acknowledging, of course, that we have had regard to existing risk as it currently stands in order to baseline our work. The session today will discuss tolerable and intolerable risk factors, and in that situation we're led by the provisions of the state planning policy in having regard to magnitudes of risk and how we plan for those moving forward. So we will discuss a range of options that are available and how the state interest policy requirements can be satisfied through those different options. So just broadly, in terms of the things that we will cover off in this session, we'll look over the scope and methodologies underpinning the work, the bushfire hazard context for the Toowoomba region, as well as the bushfire risk assessment insights, and those insights are draft only at this stage. We'll also look at the risk-responsive policy and regulatory options that are available, and then a look forward to next steps. I guess before we launch in, I would invite Mayor and councillors to raise any questions or comments that you might have as we move through. As we have quite a few slides today, it might make it a bit easier than holding comments to the end, just in case that is desirable. So the objectives of this body of work are, as Heath mentioned, part of the Toowoomba Region Futures program, and understanding bushfire risk in terms of what Toowoomba's growth might look like into the future and how we might address matters of bushfire risk. The underlying purpose is, of course, drawn back to the requirements of the state planning policy. The state planning policy is a statutory instrument under the Planning Act that does require how local planning instruments integrate matters of state interest, of which bushfire risk is one. The requirements of the state planning policy are threefold. Firstly, the identification or mapping of bushfire-prone areas. So we'll move through that in just a moment. The undertaking of a fit-for-purpose risk assessment that is consistent with ISO 31000. So that is the state planning policy setting the methodology about the expectation for risk assessments and how they are conducted. Then the third component is having regard to the risk assessment, how that risk assessment then informs planning instrument responses to bushfire risk, of which, again, this is the options-based approach that we're here today to discuss in terms of what that might look like. So this diagram just sets out neatly what that actually looks like under the state planning policy. So we have the identification of risk, the undertaking of the risk assessment, and of course moving through to the planning instrument response. So the planning instrument response can include aspects of the strategic framework and strategic intent, as well as levels of assessment and moving through to an overlay code. Zoning provisions also form part of that. It is the state's expectation that a zoning-based approach is also adopted in locations where risk might need to be addressed. And just to the side there is the actual state interest policies. In terms of the body of work that we are underway with delivering, there are 4 components to it. The first being the contextual review. So we have a draft report that sets out the nature of bushfire as a hazard. So it walks through the nature of bushfire behaviour, as well as then a more detailed look at the elements of bushfire behaviour and risk that are relevant to the Toowoomba region. So it does go into things like vegetation. I'll talk to that in a moment. We've got a slide on what the contextual analysis actually contains. The contextual analysis sets, I guess, the foundation for the balance of the work. So it underpins the bushfire risk assessment, it underpins the issues and options reporting, and it also underpins the planning scheme provisions development process. So that is the first tranche of work. The second is the actual risk assessment itself. So that is a process that, again, is in accordance with ISO 31000, as well as the National Emergency Risk Management Guidelines, NERAG, as well as the Queensland Emergency Risk Management Framework, the QERMF. And it is certainly the state's view that alignment with the QERMF, perhaps more so than ISO and NERAG, which have been considered as part of QERMF, is the preferred approach. We do keep in mind, of course, that Council is underway with a QERMF body of work that is multi-hazard across the region. That is a disaster management project. We have been liaising with Council's disaster management team in relation to that work. However, that body of work, as I mentioned, because of its disaster management focus, is much more focused on existing risk. Our work is focused on future risk. So those are the differentiating factors there. Following the risk assessment process, we are currently underway with the issues and options reporting, and that is currently coming together. It is not complete. And that will be further worked on after today's session. That issues and options report really goes into the planning-related issues that are prevalent across the region that are identified in the risk assessment, and then the planning-based options that are available in response to that, because there's never one silver bullet. There's always a range of tools and processes and opportunities that might be able to respond to certain risks. Moving forward from this particular process, we'll then move into drafting planning scheme provisions. Elements that Council might consider embedding into the strategic framework, into the strategic intent, through to options for the levels of assessment, as well as an actual draft bushfire overlay code. So that completes the body of work that we are undertaking as part of this process, and again, that is still underway. So we'll just spend a moment moving through the observations from the contextual analysis, and the items that have been considered look at the key characteristics of the community. So that's both from a landscape perspective as well as from a community-based perspective. So we do look at demographic and the socio-economic context of the region. So the key economic drivers, where the economic hubs are, where community townships are located, what their dynamics are, the demography of those particular townships, and how they might differentiate from each other. We also then look at the elements of bushfire hazards. So these are looking at fuel loads, at fire weather, at climate drivers behind changing season on season fire weather characteristics, as well as topography. And just noting that Julie Brooke is actually working on Council's landslide assessment. And so that's why we're both here today, because there are segues, particularly when it comes to steep slope, where we do have a culmination of both bushfire and landslide risk potential. We also go through the policy and regulatory environment, including relevant research. So there is a range of research that has been conducted across Australia in terms of things like impacts on building loss. So what are the trends that we're seeing in Australia around building loss? As well as, unfortunately, we do have to look at fatalities and what the trends of fatalities are. It is really important in a land use planning context that we have an understanding of these impacts so that we can plan better for responding to hazard and risk. Fire history is also a key component, and the region is no stranger to fire, of course. There are certain locations that have seen fire both recently, but as well as in a historical sense. So there have been evacuations, there has been property loss. So those are important considerations for us to have regard to. We also look at and provide a baseline understanding of the different elements of the bushfire attack mechanism. So how bushfire attack actually impacts on the built people. So that is flame contact, radiant heat exposure, ember and firebrand attack, fire-driven winds and smoke, but just acknowledging that wind and smoke are not part of the planning framework. In terms of the analysis and insights drawn from the contextual work that we have undertaken, it is acknowledged that the Toowoomba region experiences fire activity and is likely to become more fire-prone into the future. So we have looked at long paddock data that has been prepared by the Department of Environment and Science. We've also had contact with the team undertaking Council's temperate climate study, to understand some of the insights from their work that's being drawn through. There has been a history of events in certain parts of the region. Mind you, in the scale of the region, these are only kind of small locations. We have to have regard to the size and the breadth of the region. So it is isolated to certain locations. Climate and weather trends have changed for those decades since the 1980s across the region. So as per the first point, we are moving into a more fire-prone era, and that's of course not isolated to Toowoomba, that's more general across Australia and even globally. Climate influences may generate the increased likelihood of fire into the future, and one of the key ignition factors, I suppose, that we have in Australia is arson, but we must not. It is important that we must not overplay that. We do have natural phenomena as well, including lightning strike, that do lead to bushfire ignition. Fire weather and fire behaviour varies drastically across the region. So depending on fuel loads and topography, it does change quite markedly from east to west, basically. And also that the urban bushland interface is continuing to expand. And again, that is not a factor that is isolated to just Toowoomba. So in terms of the risk assessment, if we start with the mapping, there is obviously a bushfire hazard overlay as part of the current planning scheme. So we have run data analytics against that. However, the state has introduced statewide bushfire-prone areas mapping, and it is the current view of the state planning policy that governments or local governments are to have regard to the statewide bushfire-prone areas mapping. If council is not prepared to outright adopt that mapping, it must undertake its own mapping process. So there are options available around that. The current mapping was prepared in 2015 with quite a high level of accuracy recorded through peer assessment at that time. However, what we have seen is obviously, since it is now 6 years old, development and changes to our landscape have perhaps altered that slightly. So the intention was that the state mapping was going to be updated quite regularly, every 6 months or so, but however that has not happened. There was an update in 2017, however that was isolated to southeast Queensland. So those changes did not occur in Toowoomba. Those changes related to the removal of small patches and corridors of vegetation that, whilst they could carry a nuisance ignition, they wouldn't be able to support a rate of spread that would sufficiently pose a risk to either property or people. And so that is the process that QFES is now moving through statewide, and there will be revised statewide bushfire-prone areas mapping prepared. That will, in all likelihood, occur prior to the adoption of a new planning scheme for Toowoomba. So it is likely that it will be the state's new mapping that is in place then, and council has the opportunity to adopt that at that time for the purposes of its overlay. It does vary from the current overlay mapping in that it introduces 3 categories rather than 2. So the current overlay has high fire risk and medium fire risk, whereas the statewide mapping has medium, high and very high. The current statewide mapping is tied to fire line intensity. So considerations of fuel load, of fire weather and of topography have been included in understanding the fire line intensities across Queensland. So there is quite a rigorous background of fire science that has been used to develop this mapping. Is it perfect? No, it's not. No mapping will ever be perfect because our landscapes are dynamic. However, the methodology underpinning the new state mapping is robust. I might say that it is more robust than perhaps the methodology that supported SPP 103, which was the old natural hazards state planning policy. That was brought into effect in 2003. It was repealed in 2013. My understanding is that that is the methodology that underpins Council's current mapping. So what we're seeing is that new fire science and certainly the rapid pace of research that has been conducted, particularly since Black Saturday, has underpinned the new mapping. And so the risk assessment that we have conducted is based on the new mapping. However, we have considered Council's existing mapping as well.
Mr Chair.
Question?
Question. So, thank you. Does that mean that those areas of sort of very high potential risk is over on the escarpment? Is that because of the topography? Is it?
There's two reasons there. Obviously, the steep topography, you're absolutely correct, is one part of that. That region also incorporates quite high fuel loads in comparison to the rest of the region. So we do see different vegetation communities occurring in this location as well. There are areas of fuel loads that exceed 35 tonnes per hectare, and that category is amongst the highest in the state. So there is that differentiation there, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Councillor Rebecca, and then Councillor Nancy.
Thank you, Chair.
Carroll.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Laura. Thank you, Laura. It is a little bit hard for us to see, well, for me to see on that statewide BPA mapping, but given that that takes in the entire Toowoomba Regional Council, I mean, that to me looks like basically the whole of Toowoomba is very high potential bushfire intensity leading up into high fields. Can you give some clarity on that, please? That little circle that you just did then,
Yep.
Where is that?
Around here.
Yeah, so what's the westernmost edge there?
The westernmost edge is probably in proximity to the New England Highway.
Right.
So we're looking between the New England Highway and the LGA boundary to the east.
And how far up to the north? I mean, that to me, again, if Yarraman is right at the top, that seems to go well into Crow's Nest. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
So we're talking about a huge and a very densely populated part of the region.
That's correct.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Councillor Nancy.
Thanks, Chair. And thank you for the presentation today. I just wondered, is council and state government responsibility in relation to fuel reduction taken into consideration in all of this?
The current approach from a land use planning perspective is that we are required to look at worst case scenario, which is maximum fuel loads. So we certainly acknowledge that management programs are in place for large parts of the region. However, from a land use planning perspective, because there's no guaranteed certainty that management practices will be undertaken year on year, we have to assume maximum fuel loads.
See, I think everyone has to carry the burden here. We can't just expect the landholder to carry the burden. I think that we have an obligation as council, as does the state government in relation to their land, that we actually have an obligation to reduce the fuel load, which reduces the risk as well. And I feel like this is one-sided in only focusing on the landholder.
Can't do it on part, can't you?
Sure. Fuel load is characterised by a few different things, but it is the volume of material that could burn on a per hectare basis. So it is measured in tonnes per hectare. Some vegetation communities demonstrate different characteristics in terms of fuel load compared to others. That is principally due to the fact that some vegetation communities will produce much higher levels of dead and decaying material, but they also perhaps carry much more fuel in terms of consideration of the surface, the near surface and the canopy layers. So it's also taking into consideration the arrangement of fuels, and that's principally what drives fuel load measurements.
When you talk about arrangement of fuel, you're probably involving their slope as well of the land. I imagine that area that Councillor Von Hoff spoke of before, that would be principally, I'd imagine, sloping land, and that would have an impact?
It certainly has an impact on bushfire behaviour and intensity. Fuel load calculations, though, only look at the magnitude of fuel load, so it does not include slope.
Okay. Councillor Nancy, you...
If I could just do a quick follow-up. Thanks, Councillor Paul. So where a council, not only us, but any council actually puts in fire breaks in areas as well, which reduces the potential, is that taken into consideration? I just worry that this is all too one-sided and not taking into consideration all aspects of it.
Certainly where there are fuel breaks and changes in vegetation, that is considered as part of the mapping. And so those locations where that exists, usually that will manifest in a change to the mapping, whether it gets removed or it gets downgraded, but it does have an effect on the mapping. I guess the challenge around taking into account land management practices is that, speaking frankly, the majority of fuels are typically on private land, and so I can appreciate that's how this appears. However, this particular study is more about the future land zoning and taking into a strategic account of areas of bushfire risk, and there are a range of ways to do that.
Thank you.
Councillor Summerfield, that concluded?
That'll do for now, thanks.
Councillor Carroll?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So this is, I have issues with down to the south here because I used to be the mayor down there, and I'm very aware that the fuel load along the escarpment down there is just as great as it is in the north. Absolutely just as great, and it's been downgraded down there. So why is that, number one? Number two, with the private landowners, they have the advice of the Rural Fire Brigade, which go and assist them to do private burns, and then that's been happening for many years, and I'm hopeful that still happens, because I'm aware that right down there, all the way down there and on our boundary with the Lockyer Valley, that is just so. Number one, the question, why is it more densely shown in the north than it is in the south? Because when the easterly wind roars along the escarpment there, that we had fire all the way from Crow's Nest right down almost to Clifton,
Yes.
and nothing has changed down there.
Yep.
Nothing at all. So why is there the difference there, number one? And number two, is it because we're just looking at where future planning is going to go rather than the actual? I would have thought that we're mapping this as is and with the risk as it is, rather than choosing one to highlight against the other, because I'm very aware of that land down there.
Absolutely. This mapping is hazard-based mapping, so it's not risk mapping is probably the first point to
But
make.
it's a hazard. Fire's a hazard.
It's a hazard, yes, but risk is about the exposure of populations, which is not considered by this mapping. This is only about slope and fuel load and fire weather. I would hazard a guess that if we factored in part of Lockyer Valley's boundary, that certainly demonstrates quite a magnitude of fire hazard in that location.
If I can just have a
Yes,
follow-up,
that's fine,
thanks, Mr
Councillor
Mayor.
Carroll.
Lockyer Valley's down on the flat more than up the top. Most of the Toowoomba Regional Council boundary is up, and it comes back up over the escarpment, and I can see it's a hazard. It's the same hazard as it is in the north. My question is, why is it not shown the same?
It could be
Could I just maybe jump in there? If you think back to the flood hazard mapping, the flood hazard mapping was based on the engineering analysis. So what's happening here is the equivalent in the fire terms of that engineering analysis. The hazard mapping will follow. Once we've established the facts on the ground in terms of the criteria that's being discussed here, we will then go into a hazard analysis as part of the policy of working it up. Exactly the same as with the flood analysis.
So I'm still struggling
So
here
it
because
certainly is hazardous.
all that experience and what happened there in 2004, 2005, it's all still exactly the same. And I don't know why we're reinventing the wheel.
Noted. The only commentary I could have there is we could speak to QFES about the vegetation layers, because that would probably be where I'm leading to. If it is indeed the same as the northern area, it is probably a factor of the regional ecosystem mapping that was used as an input. In saying that, I am aware that the revised mapping that QFES is undertaking will be using the 2020 regional ecosystem data. From a statewide perspective, that's the best data currently available. The only other option to look at that particular location would be to undertake a bespoke fuel load assessment across that region to inform the mapping.
So I might be a bit confused here. We've got the same people in the Rural Fire Brigade out there that have fought fires along there for 20 years. And it's exactly the same, and I just don't understand why. I don't, if we're going to do mapping, it should be correct.
I will take that on note and have a look at that.
Councillor McDonald, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Mr Mayor. Thank you. Through you to Laura. Thanks very much, Laura. Just from a time frame, I know you said the state mappings this year, there'll be an upgrade of that. Do you know how that time frame works with our mapping, when our last mapping was done?
My understanding is the current planning scheme overlay, correct me if I'm wrong, Heath, was 2010. Yeah, I was going to say 2011. So,
okay, so I guess that's where I'm trying to just picture the assessment of both and how. Obviously on the eastern side, on the escarpment, you can see the similarities, but what strikes me is the southwest of the Shire. It's quite different, the mapping on both. So obviously those 4 years of when it was done, something's changed in that period.
So I think yeah, I think this is going to be an area that we'll have to do more investigation with QFES in terms of the mapping.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you.
Any further questions?
They are, but they're still a different in the categories.
Yeah, and I think there was veg mapping gaps in the state forest, which is why it would be.
And that might be why it is. But there's no gaps, not many.
Back to you, Laura.
So just moving on from the mapping, in terms of how the risk assessment has been undertaken, in order to have a more particular focus on different parts of the region, we have divided the region into a series of precincts. These are for analysis purposes only, so that we can have a more bespoke discussion on different locations. So this doesn't have a bearing on any part of the risk assessment, except that we can be more specific about different parts of the region. So these are all based on the ABS SA2 levels, noting that the Toowoomba urban area is a conglomeration of a series of SA2 areas that have been joined together, and this also reflects the Toowoomba urban area that is used as part of the SEQ regional plan. For large areas of John Darien, Pittsworth and Clifton Greenmount, I say large areas, not all, grass fire is probably the higher, element of risk exposure. That is because we're looking at large-scale cropping lands and agricultural lands on the Condamine floodplain. So you can see, even from the mapping, that there is a reduction in fuel loads and bushfire-prone areas throughout that central corridor of the region.
Except around the edge.
That's right. So in terms of exposure and vulnerability, and just noting that the mapping on here is indicative only, so Wilson's just handing out the full suite of maps. We have undertaken an exposure and vulnerability analysis. As mentioned, we do need to look at existing exposure and vulnerability as a baseline to look at future risk. So this is not a disaster management exercise. This is so that we can understand existing risk in order to look forward at future risk. So there is a separate exposure and vulnerability assessment being undertaken by Council as part of the QERMF process that will be much more detailed around assets. So the range of things that we've looked at obviously is the area exposed and the population. And I suppose this is probably a coarse calculation of the exposed population and exposed dwelling numbers. You will note that Council's current mapping does not include the 100-metre buffer around bushfire-prone areas that is now included in the state planning policy. That 100-metre buffer is probably not the correct terminology to be using. Within that 100-metre area around bushfire hazard, you are still exposed to the hazard. So flame contact, radiant heat and ember attack are still observed in that particular location. And this is where we see 85% of dwellings lost to bushfire in Australia is within 100 metres of bushland. So that is why the importance of the buffer is vital. So we have looked at what's within 100 metres. We have also looked at what's within 500 metres and 700 metres. So we are not required to do that and this will not manifest in the planning scheme itself, but from a strategic perspective, we do need to understand what is going on in the surrounding area. This is particularly relevant when we're looking at evacuation. Because we need to be allowing people to move beyond 100 metres from the bushland interface. And so that's why it becomes really important to look at what's going on in the broader landscape.
Question, if I can.
A question, Councillor Summerfield.
Thank you. So I'm just wondering, Sarah, what does that mean for, I'm Mr. and Mrs. Smith and I've got a property, 1,000 acres just outside Oakey. What does that mean for me?
It depends if bushfire-prone land is mapped on the property.
Let's say there is.
And it depends on whether there is some form of work that is proposed within 100 metres of that hazard. And if that's the case, the planning scheme first needs to understand what sort of land uses may or may not be appropriate in that location. And then secondly, are there planning provisions in terms of the code requirements around for land uses that might be acceptable in that location? Are there planning provisions that should apply? Whether it be around siting or water supply or a range of different things that the code might want to address.
So we've got a hotspot on our 1,000 acres. And we're going to be directed by council or whoever that we've got to change the management of our property, including how we run it. Is that what you're saying?
No, this is specifically about land uses, not about land management.
Could you clarify what you mean by that?
Sorry? Yeah, so a building activity or an agricultural activity in terms of a built form.
Okay, so I'm not being difficult. I just need to understand what this means for our residents. So, so if I've got a house on that property that I live in, what impact does it have on me?
If the house is existing, none.
None. So it's only if I want to build a house on.
That's correct.
A new residence on.
Yes. Or a feedlot or some other activity that has a built form.
Such as a hay shed.
Hay shed,
It depends. This is what we're here to discuss. Are there land uses that should or shouldn't be triggered? So there's been no determination of that at this stage.
Okay, well, that's what I'm trying to flesh out. We need to understand what implications there are for our residents.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Councillor O'Shea.
Sorry, Mr Mayor, that was my exact question around land uses and what. So that was just answered. But I suppose I'll ask additionally to that, so probably more to you, Stuart. So the way that this, when we're finished with it, will come out will be very similar, as you sort of mentioned a few times, what we did with flood mapping. So just around what land uses can be in future. So in terms of what's currently there now, that's not. So if I'm that current landholder, thinks I'm not impacted, it's just future land uses, and what exact land uses they can be on those areas is what we're determining, correct? Or will determine. Yeah.
And I'd imagine existing land use would require the appropriate management around that if it was deemed to be. Councillor Summerfield mentioned a hay shed. Well, imagine the logical thing, anyone that owned a hay shed and was in an area that was a bit fire prone, they'd have to take the steps to protect it, I'm sure, by fire breaks and that kind of thing. Imagine, if there was one existing.
Yes, absolutely. It may also be that it's the determination of council that land uses such as that in a rural zone, for example, might not trigger a planning requirement. That's not to say it won't still trigger a building requirement, and that will depend on the class of building it is and whether it is triggered by the building regulations. That's an entirely separate kettle of fish.
Councillor Rebecca?
Thanks, Chair. Through you, maybe to Stuart. So you mentioned feedlots. So say there is a property owner at the moment who has an amount of land, and it is in their business development plan in the next, in 2030, that they will come to council for a material change of use, and they plan on starting a feedlot, wherever. Will we, and when in this process, will we have the opportunity to consider those kind of tangible examples, Councillor Summerfield's hay shed, for instance? When will we actually consider the nuts and bolts of what this actually means for people? I imagine it's not today. So when is that? And at what point do we have to be giving mind to that? Because I'm a little mindful that sometimes these things get momentum, and from where I sit here, it can be very hard to pull them back.
You're talking about policy or land use?
Policy pertaining to land use.
Well, I guess fundamentally, as it was and is with flooding, it's a natural hazard. Fire is dangerous, and in some ways more dangerous and more deadly than flooding. And it can cause more property loss. So the whole thing about land use planning is you try to minimise the hazardous situations, and that's why I was trying to differentiate before with Councillor Taylor, that as with flooding, we had to first of all do the engineering studies, the basic studies, to work out where the fire fronts are likely to be, what's dangerous in terms of fire now and into the future.
And that's the contextual review.
And that's that stuff. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, we then, in terms of to make policy sense of that, we need to look at the hazards. What sort of hazards are there? Now, there are certain levels of hazard for a detached house, to say. That's pretty much controlled once we've got policy down on paper. That's pretty much controlled by the building regulations. If you want to build in a more slightly hazardous area, then you need to spend a lot more money on protecting your house against ember attack and a whole range of other things that's in the building regs. When you come to major investments such as feedlots, for example, and you might have 80,000, 100,000 head of cattle sitting in a feedlot, the last thing you want to do is have instant barbecue the first time there's a firestorm come through. And I would have thought that a sensible investor would also be very keen to know what the situation is in terms of the hazard relating to what they're proposing to do. And in the scheme of things, we'll ultimately look at those sorts of uses that are appropriate in certain hazard areas and those that aren't. I used, for example, the fact of feedlot, but you could look at even some form of retirement home or something like that that's out near some hazardous areas where you'd need to make sure, and we will be making sure in a policy sense, that those sorts of uses probably don't get located and established in a high hazard area. But that's the ultimate. We're looking to end up with a system that will enable sensible, rational land use, allocation and planning going forward. That we have general agreement on that. That's sensible and that's not.
Cheryl, do you wish to say a few words?
Through you, Chair, I feel that the Principal Planner may have some
Can you
additional information.
go to the microphone so we can hear?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Look, councillors, the reason why we're here today is the next step in the process is to form the policy positions that answer the questions that you're raising today. Can you do this? Are you going to be prevented from doing that? We're here to get some guidance from you on what your stand is on the level of development that should be allowed or not allowed to happen within bushfire risk areas, so that we can go away and write the codes based on that policy position. So you might say to us, we don't want to see any new development in any bushfire risk areas. It's too much of a risk. People's lives and property are precious, and having any development within those areas is not acceptable. So we want our new planning scheme to be based on that position. You might have a different view that says we can have some development but not others. So we're here to tease that out today to understand what your position is, so that we can then start to write the specific provisions of the scheme that says, well, this will need approval, this doesn't need approval, that can go ahead without council needing to see it. This is the stuff that we really don't want to see in bushfire risk areas. So I think as Laura goes through the presentation, we'll start to get into that discussion.
Before we go to Councillor Nancy, I'm just wondering if this will inform the insurers. Once we do this mapping, as we did with the floods, will that have an impact on insurers?
The insurers already have the statewide bushfire-prone areas mapping and have had since 2015. When the new mapping comes out, they'll also receive that as a matter of course. So it will depend on whether council decides, once that mapping is available, whether to adopt it or whether to undertake additional that inform it. But either way, they'll receive that detail and that will inform naturally.
Thank you.
Their
Councillor Nancy.
Thank you. And understanding we are a land of fire and flooding rain, as was written a long time ago, I'm just wondering, as part of the process moving forward, we could have very clear definition of what sensible, tolerable and vulnerable all mean, because for many of us they have very varied ideas of what that actually is, and so we need to understand what we're actually signing off on, whether it be vulnerable or tolerable or sensible.
Certainly. Our risk assessment and our issues and options report do provide definitions. We've also provided options for council to consider an amalgamated approach that addresses multiple hazards using the same definitions. So in some cases that's not easy, and in some cases it's pretty easy. So where we're looking for those efficiencies, we're certainly identifying those along the way. I guess just briefly, in terms of the existing land use exposure and vulnerability, from the analysis that we've undertaken, there's perhaps nothing too particular that wasn't a surprise. You would naturally expect to see higher exposure in those zones that are rural residential, and perhaps even community facilities, although The quantum of community facility zone land across the region does stand out. However, we also note that in certain locations, particularly to the east of Crow's Nest, that there are very large allotments that are zoned community facilities, and that is perhaps skewing this data just slightly.
Sorry, can I just ask the question? That would be the dam area?
Yes, it is,
Yeah,
yes.
thank you.
So that is probably what's coming through there.
Yep.
What we would say from a land use perspective is that we have also looked at the limited development zone and the quantum of land that is zoned for limited development that comprises bushfire-prone areas, and it is quite high. So we already know that council is doing a fundamental job of zoning lands in the past that are probably exposed to multiple hazards, being flood, landslide and bushfire collectively through that zone. That's also replicated when we look at the open space zone. So I appreciate this is only a selection, a very small selection of zones here, so we could make a graph actually look decent, but there is quite a comprehensive analysis of the different zones across the region that we have looked at. So the summary of that is that the existing zoning rationale across the region has been doing a great job of identifying those areas of increased potential risk and responding to those either through zoning for limited development or zoning as rural, etc. In terms of the level of risk, and noting, of course, that Clifton Greenmount is probably something now after today that we need to return to look at, having a look at consequence and likelihood and vulnerability, the Queensland Emergency Risk Management Framework sets out the framework against which risk is analysed. And we can see here that there's the Toowoomba urban area, the Crow's Nest Rosalie precinct, going back to that visual of the map I showed you previously, and the Millmerran precinct, where we are seeing a higher level of risk. And you can see just in the diagram below the very complex table that gives rise to that. We're seeing lower in Pittsworth and John Darien, and that is principally, again, because we don't have much bushfire-prone area in that location because of the land use, the rural land use that's occurring. And Clifton Greenmount will take on notice to return and have a look at that after we speak to...
Distinct.
Absolutely, after we speak to QFAS. This also does reflect the existing, has been undertaken as part of Council's local disaster management plan, which does indicate a likelihood of likely and a consequence of moderate. And so it does identify bushfire as a significant risk for the region in response to that. That is a whole of region assessment, whereas this is broken down into relatively smaller locations that are still large. From a built-in human social perspective, we have mapped, identified potential vulnerable land uses and existing infrastructure assets. This is based on the best data that we have available and data that was provided by Council. So this is a mash-up, I suppose, of Council data sets and of state available data as well. What we have included in here are schools and childcare centres and aged care facilities that are not otherwise mapped. So we did a data scrape process to identify those exact locations. Again, what we can see, and we've only included the map here of the Toowoomba urban area, but there are other maps in the set here, is that most vulnerable facilities and infrastructure assets are actually located outside of bushfire-prone areas. So the quantum is actually quite small. So that's obviously a significant benefit. In terms of evacuation, and this is a sticky one, so we're not looking at evacuation in terms of how emergency services would plan evacuation. From a land use planning perspective, we're looking at where locations of potential evacuation issues or challenges might exist. And it's those locations that we have exposure of the road network and the confluence of potential pinch points, which might mean that certain locations might have some challenges in a fire event, depending on the circumstances that prevail on the day, to evacuate. This is a really difficult process to go through. And to that end, we have only looked at exposure of the road network. So there are some locations where the road network might be exposed to flame contact or radiant heat. It's noted that in most cases across the region, there are multiple opportunities for evacuation, so that if one or two, perhaps, route networks were overrun by fire, or perhaps a tree fall, or poor visibility due to smoke, there generally are other opportunities. Where there are constraints, they are very localised in nature. So we're talking about specific streets, and that perhaps, given that is largely around existing risk, that becomes a disaster management exercise. So, but what that means from a land use planning context is, in those locations, should there be a land use planning response to perhaps avoid increased population in those locations if they have a challenge in evacuating.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of observations from the risk assessment, those precincts that are subject to a higher potential bushfire risk include the Toowoomba urban area, Crow's Nest, Rosalie and Millmerran. So those are those precincts. So they're large scale. Some townships in the region have the ability to accommodate further growth. So there are allotments that are zoned for a land use that is not currently reflected by what's on the ground. And there is an opportunity for planning provisions to guide risk-responsive growth in these locations. So again, that comes back to the policy questions that we're asking through this process today. Further development to the east of the New England Highway, so from around Highfields up towards Crow's Nest, is likely to generate higher future risk if development in that location goes ahead. That is not to say there is the state planning policy position of avoid in the very first instance, and where you cannot avoid, then we mitigate the risk. So the question is, do we avoid or do we mitigate? When we're talking about avoidance, there's a range of tools that we can be using, and we'll get to that in a moment. Land to the west of the city, so west of Highfields and towards Westbrook, for example, they're not immune to hazard, but that hazard exposure is certainly a lot lower than perhaps other parts of the Toowoomba urban area. If we're looking at a growth management approach, in terms of where development might be oriented into the future, those are just some locations, really just around the Toowoomba urban area, as an example, where a risk-responsive approach to growth management might occur.
Councillor Rebecca, you got a question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Through you, Laura, before we move on from this, I'm just after a little bit more clarity. There seems to be one spot that's a standout, and these pages aren't marked, so I'm going to point on the...
It's the Toowoomba urban area heat map.
Right, so it's to the west, and if...
Yes.
I'm thinking that that's the airport Charlton Well Camp, is that correct?
I think it's actually north of there. And I think this is a really good point to explain the inputs to this mapping. So this is exposure mapping. It is not risk mapping, once again, because risk is really hard to map. So it is a combination of what we have used to understand exposure is allotment sizes. So for the Toowoomba urban area, we used a threshold allotment size of 700 square metres as an average allotment size. So what we see then is a higher density in the Toowoomba urban area compared to other locations, and we've moderated that as we've gone through. But also then exposure to mapped hazard, and essentially the darker the colour is a reflection of both density as well as exposure to a higher level of bushfire hazard. So I appreciate the complexities between exposure and risk, and exposure is a significant function of risk, but these maps don't tell the full story either, because we're not looking at aspects of tolerance in terms of availability of water supply, or if those locations were actually planned to have perimeter roads and are in accordance with the code, which I do believe in that location, because it's so new, it would actually comply with that. So these are very coarse maps.
Sorry, thank you for that. But just to understand, because it is an anomaly on this, it's
Yes.
like a very red dot, particular
Yes.
dot. So you're saying it's not Charlton Well Camp, it's not the airport, it's a little to the north?
Yes, yes.
So what, Cotswold Hills or something, is it? Or
It's around that location, yeah.
right, okay, thank you.
All right, moving on now through to the issues and options analysis. So just in terms of, I guess, setting the context of the issues and options analysis, and again, we are currently in the process of moving through the issues and options analysis, so that reporting is not complete. Today's conversation will be fed into informing that issues and options work. The matters considered by the issues and options analysis include the aspects of legislation and regulation that council is required to abide by. So obviously there's some policy intents embedded in that in terms of the implementation of the state planning policy. There's also broader best practice approaches across Australia, so it's not a case of no development in bushfire-prone areas. The policy is really about understanding the threshold of exposure that marks the difference between tolerable and intolerable. Across Australia, that is uniformly recognised as being at 29,000 kilowatts per metre squared of fire line intensity exposure. So if we're familiar with bushfire attack levels, so BALs, that's BAL 29. So what we see across Australia is a general understanding that new development that exceeds exposure to 29,000 kilowatts generally moves into the intolerable threshold. There are building responses for exposure at that magnitude, but that comes back to a question of whether a planning permit is required or whether it's just a building permit. If it's a building permit, it certainly can just move through that process. If it's a new subdivision, for example, the general policy is around trying to limit exposure, and there's a number of ways of doing that through design processes. And that again is embedded in code provisions. There's also, this is stepping a little bit outside of the planning process, but the Queensland disaster management arrangements certainly that we must have regard to in this context. And as I've already mentioned, the building code and regulations. So in Queensland, we are required under legislation not to duplicate matters of building interest. So any building works that are regulated under either the Building Code of Australia or the building regulation, we cannot have regard to in a planning context. So that is espoused under the Planning Act. So that draws some natural limitations to allow development in bushfire-prone areas. The building response to that, and whether that ends up being BAL flame zone and therefore costs another $100,000, is not a planning issue, that's a building issue. So that is certainly outside of this particular process. There's then an analysis of the requirements under the state planning policy, and noting that only at 4:30 p.m. on Friday afternoon, the state released a new guidance document underpinning the state planning policy, so new guidance material. The state's view is that it does not change grossly any guidance material, non-statutory provisions under the state planning policy. However, we're still working our way through that, acknowledging that there is some content from a bushfire perspective that has been removed And so we will be speaking with the department about that. But irrespective, the guidance material is non-statutory anyway. So it is indeed just guidance. And then the observations from the risk assessment also filter through to the issues and options analysis in terms of whether there's a settlement policy response, a land use-based response through zoning, and then the provisions of statutory controls that would then be in effect for tolerable risk development. So the strategic process that we're going through at the moment really identifies that. This allows council the opportunity to consider development on a merits-based arrangement where appropriate, but really the goal is about where council feels that intolerable risk exists. Ideally, the provisions of zoning controls, the strategic framework and the combined strategic approach address that quantum of risk so that we avoid issues and considerations of risk being played out through development assessment. Because by the time we get to development assessment stage, we've removed a lot of tools that we might have had to assess these applications because we've moved into a DA environment. So just broadly and very quickly, the risk-based planning process that we have used to go through this work obviously starts with looking at fire behaviour. We then look at risk multipliers, so looking at potential issues of evacuation as well as exposure to those higher fire line intensities. So where we see potential for quite erratic, intense fire behaviour. So the current mapping, the current state mapping, the fire line intensity process or methodology upon which it's based gives rise to us understanding where those locations might be. But acknowledging also that in many cases that might need to be verified at the site level. So the mapping in the planning scheme is a trigger, but we can also use the mapping to inform our strategic approaches. We look at the community context, of course, community is first, and looking at also the aspirations of the region, both from a community perspective, but also from an economic perspective, because these are really important factors when we're thinking about the different land uses that can go ahead in certain locations. Existing development, as I mentioned, as a baseline to look at potential for future risk, and then looking at a gap analysis. So we have undertaken an assessment against the current planning scheme provisions as they relate to bushfire hazard against the requirements of the state planning policy, then to understand where those potential areas of needing to bring into line with the state planning policy that might exist. So we're currently moving through that at the moment. There's then our tools for a responsive policy approach, and some of those we'll put on the table in just a moment. In terms of determining, yes.
Question, Megan.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I know you touched on it earlier, Laura. Just going back to that first tile there, the fire behaviour. So that analysis is all done in the light of climate change, isn't it? It's all with that as a part of the context, yeah.
That's correct. So the state's mapping methodology does include, it is climate adjusted. So inherently off the bat, that is a key difference between the council's current overlay mapping and the current state mapping. So it is climate adjusted. It is based on a 5% EEP or a 1 in 20 year event. That is higher than the building requirements. So for every other state in Australia, they use a combined planning and building threshold of a 1 in 50 event. We're using a 1 in 20 event in Queensland, so a smaller but more frequent event. But our building provisions are also much, much lower than the approach to other states. That's a state-based matter that has been discussed extensively at that level. So, but that's the current context there.
Thank you.
We have also, as I mentioned in the contextual analysis, looked at climate change and One of the tools that we have used as part of that does indicate an uptick of annual fire weather across the region between 5 to 10 forest fire danger index points, so FFDI points. So our fire danger days are measured on an FFDI based approach, so 0 to 100. We do exceed 100, but that's the approach that's based on. So there is a potential variation of 5 to 10 points across the region, moving east to west. So it does grow moving west, which is not surprising. That's prevalent across the state as well.
Laura? Oh, Councillor James. You're right. Back to you, Laura.
Thank you. So in terms of benchmarking what intolerable risk looks like, because it's really important to unpack that, we use the ALARP principle, which is driving risk as low as reasonably practicable. So again, the emphasis there is on the basis of as reasonably as practical as possible. So there's different ways that we can do that. There's processes through treatments of avoid, mitigate, transfer and accept. And usually where you have some level of risk but it's deemed to be quite low, you can move through to the transfer or accept process. When we're thinking about transferring risk, however, we need to think about who we're transferring it to. So if we're not dealing with it in a planning or a building context, we're deferring or transferring that risk through to our emergency services, through to insurers, and then ultimately through to the community. So what we need to be focusing on is the quantum of risk that is ultimately being transferred to the community, because they're the ones with the least amount of resources to be able to respond to that risk. So this is what this system is trying to achieve. When we look at risk multipliers, when we think about, well, what could be the context of potentially intolerable risk? Really, in a land use planning context, it comes down to, can our communities evacuate? And we have to acknowledge that there's no guarantees here. We can't remove risk. There's no such thing as completely avoiding it. We've got existing risk. So there's no possible way that the planning system can take responsibility for knowing whether, in all circumstances, the millions or billions of circumstances that might exist on any given day, that evacuation can absolutely occur. But what we need to look at are the characteristics around whether we think we've potentially got a challenge or not. And in terms of evacuation, we've certainly been working with Council's disaster management team. And like I said, this is a really complex approach, and what it's coming down to is it's coming down to individual streets, basically. Like I said, most townships, most communities have multiple opportunities to evacuate. Some of those might be challenged by the fact that some alternative options are not sealed. And if we have smoke impacts and we have vegetation right up to the roadside, it might become really constrained to evacuate. In which case, we're probably likely to see an emergency warning saying, if you have not left by now, you shouldn't be leaving. And we certainly, through the Black Summer fires, we definitely did see that in Queensland, where there were those warnings that said, if you have not evacuated, you now need to take shelter, which is not pleasant to see. So that's one of those categories, and the other one is looking at, well, where do we have exposure to locations where we may see, and that's important, we may see it, where we may see quite erratic or intense fire line intensity. So where do we have those higher fuel loads and those steeper topographies, because they really drive bushfire behaviour. So we do tend to see more erratic and intense fire in those locations. For slope, for example, for fires running uphill, they will gather momentum much more quickly than going down. So there is a massive increase in rate of spread where we're moving up steep topography. As part of that, the localised effects of winds are likely to give rise to some pretty localised bushfire behaviour that might include wind eddies, fire tornadoes as they're called, and general conditions that where you're standing locally are very different to prevailing conditions, and that's because of the impact of localised winds as they're coming across that complex topography. So this is not to say that development that is exposed to very high potential fire line intensity is just a no-go, but these are the sorts of risks that we need to be thinking about in terms of, do they actually present a higher level of exposure to potential future risk? And there's some detail included in there. In terms of the spatial context around some of these indicators, in the Toowoomba urban area along the escarpment naturally, and there have been studies that Council has commissioned into preparedness along the escarpment. So we know that that development along the escarpment to an extent is exposed to potentially higher levels of risk. It's not just about exposure though, it's about the quantum of population in that location and also the value of property in that location. So those are considerations as well. Moving towards the east, so around Blue Mountain Heights, Highfields, Spring Bluff to Kabala, that area between the New England Highway and the LJ boundary to the east, again represents a challenging location, particularly in terms of the ability to evacuate for certain locations that are relying on one road to get back to the New England Highway. And then from the New England Highway, depending on where you are, it might be natural to come into Toowoomba City, in which case we're likely to see quite high traffic volumes on the New England Highway. But again, it depends where you try to enter the network, and this starts moving into traffic engineering approaches. So there is a natural limit on the extent to which this work can get into the nuts and bolts of that. Again, this is general in nature. There's Hampton, Ravensbourne, so this is in terms of existing areas where we're seeing potentially on the heat mapping increased exposure. With Hampton, we have bushland in town. So that is a particular consideration there, along with the road network. So we've got quite high fuel loads coming into town, as well as the predominance of the New England Highway. But again, there are other roads, but to a point they become unsealed along journeys leaving Hampton as well. And this is assuming different fire runs as well. So for the most part, I mean, for Hampton, fire could actually transition into town from almost any direction. It's probably more likely to gain in momentum in terms of intensity from the east, but planning has to almost have regard to the fact that it could come from any direction. Ravensbourne, because of the existing development located there, but acknowledging that that's already zoned rural, even for smaller residential allotments in Ravensbourne. The eastern side of Crow's Nest, and that's really about exposure to intact landscape level exposure to the east, and the rural residential estates west of Millmerran, which Council will be familiar with. And whilst we see lower fuel loads in Millmerran, when we look at aerial photography, we know that the houses in this location, for the most part, do not include asset protection zones. And some of the roads are unsealed. It's quite the network. And then also the Gore Highway is quite exposed as well to flame contact and radiant heat exposure. So again, this is all around existing, but it's about understanding existing to give rise to, well, where do we see the future here in responding to the risk profile in these locations? So part of our process recently was also to undertake a survey with council officers to understand what their views were on how the function of the existing planning scheme is operating, as well as the desires for future regulation and what their views were. Oh, I should probably just cover off on what we did. So we did provide an anonymous online survey. There were 8 questions as part of that survey, and we received 13 responses from different council departments. Those were across 4 key themes. So we looked at the current scheme, desired outcomes, risk tolerance factors, and the regulatory response. So just in one quick slide, I'll try and unpack some of the more key points that we received back. From the council officer's perspective, there's a desire to enhance the effectiveness of the current scheme provisions for bushfire hazard and risk in line with the state planning policy. So the ability to go into a bit more regulatory context around certain things, for example, the ability to have effect on the need for perimeter roads, to maintain separation distance between new subdivisions and adjacent vegetation, for example. So that is identified as an opportunity under the state planning policy. A desire for a policy approach which identifies and responds to higher risk through strategic planning rather than deferring issues to the DA process. So where we know that there might be challenges, addressing it earlier in the process through a zoning-based response, so articulating what we want to see and what we don't want to see in higher risk locations. So this is not everywhere, but in higher risk locations. And having the scheme do some heavy lifting so that those complex challenges where we may have less certainty about our policy position are not being played out through the DA process, so that we've got the scheme really calibrated to taking a risk-responsive position. Desire for a policy approach to avoid vulnerable uses in bushfire-prone areas, and this is a provision of the state planning policy. It makes it very clear that ideally we are avoiding things like schools and childcare centres and aged care facilities in bushfire-prone areas, full stop. That is difficult. There are some communities that no matter where you put a facility, it is still going to be in a bushfire-prone area. And so is the answer to that, well, that community then just has to go without. So there is the ability to have certain circumstances where vulnerable facilities might be considered. It's the role of not only the overlay code, but the overall outcomes of the code and the scheme more broadly to articulate the circumstances in which that might be considered by council. Some land uses... Was there a question? Yes,
Councillor
sorry.
Summerfield, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. So, so just what you were just talking about, having a vulnerable service in a community, or the community may just have to go without that service. How would that look in our planning scheme potentially? And would that mean that we could be picking winners and losers in a scenario like that? Like we could say, well, yes, we think you'd be great in that community, we'll give you the tick, but something else that councillors may not have a preference for could then be declined. Could that be used as a tool that would not be particularly impartial?
I think the approach that we would likely be recommending is to mirror the same approach that's been taken to the consideration of vulnerable uses for flood risk. And so far that's been one of the options that we have identified. So the existing planning scheme already defines what a vulnerable use is, and the flood hazard overlay already speaks to vulnerable uses in some high-risk contexts. So we would be looking to the extent that we could, perhaps recommending a very similar policy alignment to how flood hazard is treated in relation to vulnerable uses. And again, that's streamlining across hazards and trying to simplify that so that we don't have a starkly different policy view to bushfire than we do to flood. So the scheme will articulate those circumstances where it might be considered, rather than council necessarily picking winners and losers, and providing that clarity up front.
Thank you.
Councillor James?
Sorry, yeah, thanks, Mr Mayor. Probably same line of questioning. If we're saying it's similar to around the flood mapping, so essentially would it come down to where we're talking about avoiding vulnerable uses in these areas, it would be down to one, how in that process, if someone wanted to place something there, how they can mitigate that risk, which would feed into the planning scheme? Is that essentially?
That's right, yeah. Essentially, the way that it has been crafted elsewhere in other planning schemes is that the overall outcomes will identify, ideally, we don't have these uses in a bushfire-prone area. That provides council the ability to say yes or no. Then in the actual code itself, there are provisions that could be provided that say, okay, well, if you are going to apply for this, this is the expectation and this is what you have to do to meet council's requirements.
Okay, thanks. Back to you, Laura.
Thank you, Mayor. A desire for a clear policy provision, on clearing vegetation versus bushfire protection. So in different locations across the state, we do see the approach where, for the exclusive purpose of bushfire protection, that vegetation is cleared to provide adequate separation, when the majority of the time there is the ability for a siting or urban design-based approach to actually respond to the hazard without removing the vegetation. Of course, in some cases where we have structure planning, etc., there might be, and we've had vegetation assessments undertaken, we might choose to acknowledge that vegetation might be removed. But a clarity of a policy position throughout the scheme, both in relation to the Bushfire Hazard Overlay Code as well as Council's Biodiversity Code, around those instances where vegetation might be considered for clearing only to provide bushfire protection, and whether that is seen as being acceptable. So the indication is at the moment that a clear position on that perhaps a siting and urban design-based approach is the very first option before vegetation clearing would be considered. And the last one is the desire to see design-based approaches adopted into the overlay code, which is a current gap, and it is a gap. And the state government has released bushfire resilient building guidelines for Queensland homes to assist in this space. This is one of those spaces, however, where we have to be mindful of duplicating building instruments. So there might be a natural limit on the extent to which a code can actually address these issues, and that's a legislative requirement. So I guess drilling down to it and moving into the meaty parts and talking about the planning options that are available, there are a spectrum of planning tools and approaches that can inform risk-responsive policy positions. So it need not be a case of picking one or the other. There's usually a suite of provisions that can apply, and I like to think of it as a base equaliser on an old school stereo where things might go up and down, but there's an equilibrium that's achieved through those different processes. And so that's how I really like to think about mitigation approaches. It's a belts and braces based approach. We're not relying on just one thing. The SPP does articulate the state's policy interests and expectations that we have to have regard to about how state interests are integrated into local planning instruments, and the state does make it very clear what their interests are. In this case, one of the strongest ones is around the policy of avoidance, the avoidance of future potential risk. And so that is why that needs to be qualified by a risk assessment, which is the process we're currently going through. So there are, however, a variety of ways of avoiding, but the state planning policy also indicates that where it is not possible to avoid, that we then mitigate. And so that is an important partner to that. tolerable risk, so risk that we can live with, risk that we can mitigate, risk that where we're satisfied we can transfer as well, can and should be addressed by a calibrated scheme and overlay code. So this is acknowledging that across Australia we do accept that development can occur in bushfire-prone areas under certain circumstances, and we apply planning and building and landscaping provisions to that, and we get insurance, and we manage our properties every year. We reduce fuel loads, so we're all doing our bit through a range of tools. There is also the possibility of considering a planning scheme policy. So throughout the council feedback and some of the workshops that we've had, there has been a concern about the quality of some bushfire management plans that are submitted to council as part of the development assessment process, as well as the consistency of the methodologies that are being employed. So for example, the assessment of fuel loads. The QFES has released some state provisions on how that is meant to be conducted. Council could certainly take that and move that to the next level around asserting its expectations around consistency from a regional scale about how those assessments are undertaken. Planning scheme policies are instructional only. There's no provisions in that to be assessed. It's instructional only. So it might detail, well, what's the landscaping provisions inside an asset protection zone. So you might say, well, it's got to be maintained lawns up to 10 centimetres, and you can't have a shrub underneath the drip line of a tree, and all of these sorts of things. So that's an option as well. So then the question is, how do we respond to potentially intolerable risk? Knowing that we can deal with tolerable risk, how do we deal then with intolerable risk? So our options are backzoning. This requires a site-by-site analysis and weighting of options and undertaking a feasible alternatives assessment report. So that is one of the options where if we deem a location a particular allotment, this has to be site-by-site based. If we deem it too high risk to support future development, we might choose to backzone it to rural or limited development zone. We also have the use of zoning controls to establish appropriate land use intent. So if we're looking at certain land uses and where they might be appropriate, zoning is a natural opportunity for us to allocate land uses in that regard. So driving the desired settlement pattern. So this also moves into a growth management process. The use of zoning-based precincts.
Chair. Thanks, Ms Mayor.
Oh, Councillor Megan.
Laura, talking about backzoning and those sorts of things, does that open up the question of compensation, or are we talking natural disaster and that sort of?
A feasible alternatives assessment report would have to be undertaken in order to meet the Minister's guidelines and rules requirements around the consideration of all of the options that are on the table to determine that backzoning is the only feasible, reasonable outcome. And under the legislation that has qualifications around council's exposure to compensation. So that feasible alternatives assessment report is the key to that. That is not part of this particular body of work. That would be an additional body of work.
Okay, back to you, Laura.
The use of zoning, zone-based precincts. So, for example, if we have a rural residential zone, there might be certain locations where we want to just add some provisions around. Maybe we want to increase the minimum lot size to make sure that we can achieve appropriate asset protection zones around houses. So that might not apply to the entire rural residential zone, but maybe only certain bushfire resilient precincts. That's just an idea. So that's a potential option. It might also limit certain things if we wanted to. The utilisation of levels of assessment for specific land uses. So where we think X land use, we would very much probably not want to see it, will kick it into impact assessment and require a merits-based assessment across the entire scheme. So the utilisation of those levels of assessment might be an option. That is used for other hazards. It's fair to say it's probably less used for bushfire hazard, but that's not to say it shouldn't be. I think, speaking frankly as a professional, we're in a space where perhaps bushfire, planning for bushfire protection is probably gaining pace, I suppose you could say, in its maturity. Particularly in the Queensland context, we've seen a lot of change in this space over the past 15 years. We've virtually come from having nothing to being quite attentive to bushfire hazard as part of planning processes. So there has been a large-scale shift over the past 15 years, and a lot of that, speaking frankly, was driven by the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria, and a lot of the research and learnings that have happened since then. So there are a range of tools available here. As I mentioned, growth management, and I'd spoken to this previously, so this is just a visual representation of locations where development will still be exposed to bushfire hazard, but the quantum of hazard exposure and that risk profile is much lower than other locations. So this is just an indicative map only. And really only focused on the Toowoomba urban area at this stage. So in terms of regulating risk and coming to the recommendations of today's session, the recommendation is that the drafting of bushfire policy and provisions in the new planning scheme are based on the following principles, so a principles-based approach. Development is supported in areas of bushfire risk where the risk is tolerable or where the risk can be reduced to a tolerable level through the planning process. Development is avoided in areas of bushfire risk where the risk cannot be reduced to a tolerable level. So that could be through zoning-based approaches and identifying land uses that might not be compatible with higher bushfire risk. And development involving vulnerable uses is ideally avoided in all areas of bushfire risk. So that's the recommendation, but there are some questions that follow this, and Heath, maybe do we go through those questions first before we come back to this? Okay. So I've just got 2 slides here with 5 questions. So the first question is, does Council agree or disagree that existing and future bushfire risk in the locations identified, so going back to that slide where we identified, east of the New England Highway between Highfields and Kabala, Crow's Nest to the east, etc. So that particular slide. Do they require a stronger regulatory approach under the new planning scheme to meet the state's requirements? So I guess the first question is, how does Council feel about that?
Okay, councillors, over to you. Councillor Nancy.
Look, I don't really believe we've got enough information before us before we start indicating something like that, or how we feel about that. This has only just been given to us today. It's not...
Okay. Any other comments around the room? Councillor McDonald.
Thanks, thanks very much, Mr Mayor. I guess the disclaimer to that is our responsibility to go by the statewide BPA mapping, because to me the crux of it is where will we regulate the activity that we're having? Because if we are required under the state to use the state mapping, we may not have much choice but to go by the state requirements. So is it not about what mapping we actually are legislatively obliged to use?
This question is perhaps more associated with the outcomes of the risk assessment. So the mapping identifies hazard elsewhere in the region. There are certain locations where we're identifying potential future risk might require a certain strength of land use planning response. So the mapping is sort of a separate issue, but it has been taken into consideration in terms of the observations of the risk assessment.
Just follow up.
Follow up?
Well, thank you. Through you, Mr Mayor, to Laura. I guess, Laura, you made the comment, and it's a good one, in the fact that, you know, risk management is not eliminating the risk; it's actually managing the risk. But for us as an authority that will have a fair say on what development goes where, we need to rely on the best available information, and the standard that the state give, one would hope would be the best available information. So this is why I say, if we as a council are obliged to use that information, certainly there's areas there that are different to the mapping that we have and will change over time. So we would be, I don't want to use the term, but we'd be in the firing line if we don't take into consideration the mapping that we're obliged to use in determining what development goes where. Now, going back to it's not eliminating the risk, it's managing the risk. Then it comes down to the planning scheme and how we as a community, through our planning scheme, manage that tolerable and intolerable risk. And to me, it's very clear. Tolerable risk would be managed through a code assessable, meeting the requirements that need to fit to that up to whatever the distance is. And the intolerable risk would be an impact assessable application, similar to what we have others. So that to me is, in layman's terms, that's the clearest picture that I can see going forward. We determine what mapping we use, and if we're obliged to use the state mapping, we have an obligation to fulfil that mapping that's on there and say, we've been told that this is the high risk area. We've been told that. There's houses already in that area and they exist. Now, if someone else wants to go and build in that area, based on what I've heard today, the most critical part is that they have access to get out of that area in a fire. So obviously, and this comes into the regulations that we'd have in those areas. If it's impact accessible and there's not access, 2 ways out or safe access, then it would be very hard to approve it. So to me, the crux is what mapping we use, and if we're obliged to, or we are insistent and we have to use the state mapping, we have no choice. That's as I see it. We'd be negligent to our community if we don't go by what mapping we have, but then we can use controls as to have building in tolerable areas. That's as I see it.
Councillor Megan, then Councillor Rebecca, and then Councillor Carroll.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Laura, I think this will probably filter down to your other questions too, but the 2 statements that made most sense to me today, or sort of really resonated, is if you can't avoid, how do you mitigate? And then what is the quantum of risk being transferred to the community? So I see that the only way that we can mitigate, if we can't avoid, is to have a stronger approach under the planning scheme. So that's my view, and that's probably going to filter down to the rest of the questions too.
Thanks, Megan. That's your view. Councillor Rebecca.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Looking at this state mapping, I think we need to understand that this affects tens of thousands of people in our community, if not more than 100,000 people. This is huge. And it involves Queen's Park, it involves Mary Street, Hume Street, you know, a school at Highfields, development at Kabala, potentially a retirement village in Millmerran. Like, this is absolutely, it's absolutely huge. And I think we need to have the utmost confidence in the mapping that we're relying on when we're making our decisions. And from the conversations today, that mapping isn't there. But are you saying that we'll get to that point in the mapping once you move on from the contextual review? Or can you provide some clarity on this, please?
Sure. Quite a few of those instances that you've just cited, we have had regard to in this work, and I think the important part to note is that the risk assessment has really focused on landscape scale risk, and Queen's Park is not bushfire hazard. We have not had regard to that. So the analysis of risk, as I've mentioned, is quite separate to the bushfire mapping that would be adopted by the scheme. We know that the process of knocking those smaller patches and corridors out is going to occur, and so we haven't had regard to those instances. So where we're talking about those those areas of existing potential higher risk, they're not those smaller locations. So that enables council to adopt any iteration of the state's mapping. It is important for me to state that council does not have to use the state's mapping. Council can undertake its own mapping. However, that needs to be through a completely different process through the state to ensure that QFES are supportive of the methodology used to build that mapping and the outputs of that mapping. That process would be quite a long one. So our scope as part of our work was to use the state's mapping, but in acknowledgement that the eventual overlay that council might adopt will be different. But again, our focus has been on landscape scale risk, not those small localised patches.
Can I make a comment through Mr. Mayor?
Make a comment now,
I think rather than trying to get definitive position of council in regard to the questions, I think it'd be better to ask council whether it agrees that these are reasonable questions to be answered, because I think a couple of councillors have indicated fairly clear that they want more time to think about the information, and they probably need more information as we go forward with this. And certainly they are questions that need to be answered, but I'm not sure they need to be answered today for us to move forward. But if council is happy to state, well, look, yeah, these are reasonable questions to be asked and answered in the fullness of information and time, that's a different proposition, and I think council's may be more comfortable with that.
Absolutely.
And the process from here in, if the recommendation is before us, and that would mean we continue with this study and continue to make that study inform our planning scheme, if we accept that recommendation today. Is that right, Mr. General Manager? Yep. Councillor Carroll?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't have a lot of... I suppose what I agree with Councillor Megan, I agree with Councillor Rebecca. The state mapping, in my view, isn't, and as that comes from QFES, so I have a few concerns over that. Nowhere there, though, does it say that we're adopting the state mapping. Nowhere in those two.
No.
In those two recommendations does it say we're. I'm very aware of what it took for us under the flooding mapping. It took a long time, and it was a huge situation. I don't know what you mentioned about getting somewhere by over time, but how do we do that if we don't separate out what we're not happy with and then go and do our own mapping of those areas? I believe we've got a broad brush approach here with the state mapping, and I don't think it's always right. Like, we're looking at Queen's Park, and then we're looking at the likes of Hurst Glen and Halden, which are down here with no fire, and I happen to know that that's not the case. So I think that I think we could safely do that, as you say, Stuart, but then I suppose we may need to have some type of a forward plan to tidy up what we need to tidy up. I think we don't have to do the whole lot, I wouldn't think. It'd just be certain parts of it where, and I would suggest that in those areas perhaps we could check with our rural fire brigades. They would be more familiar than anyone sitting around this table, including myself, and at those areas. So for the bit few adjustments that need to be made, I would think that. But looking through those two recommended areas of adoption, it doesn't adopt as is the state mapping.
No.
So I suppose with that in mind, I'm probably happy today to do that, but I think we need to have something written in to say that we're going to investigate or find ways to more authenticate certain areas that we're not happy with. I don't know what my colleagues think of that, so.
That's come through pretty clearly, I think.
Yeah.
Councillor Nancy, then Councillor Tim, then Councillor Rebecca.
I'm happy for Councillor Tim to go next because I've spoken a few times.
Sorry, Nancy.
I'm happy for Councillor Tim to go next. I have spoken a few times and he hasn't.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Tim.
Thanks, Nancy. Look, just to probably agree with the sentiment around the room, this is an exciting step we're taking here, but I don't think we should neglect the amount of responsibility attached to this, and I appreciate the state's requirements are, are large and onerous, and we can talk about, inadequacies all we want, but I don't see myself saying, let's disregard their requirements and then something bad happens and then we're in a bit of trouble. I just did want to pick up on a few things that 80% of community facilities in Crow's Nest and Rosalie are exposure, 60% of the township of Millmerran on your mapping, and the point that further development to the east of Ruthven Street will be a high risk. These are important factors that we need to take into account. I think you picked up on it before, Councillor Beck, that this is some significant stuff we're dealing with, and I don't know, having only been around a short time, sort of feel like we can use fire at present to say we shouldn't build there, but if you wanted to, you can use it to say we've put enough mitigating factors in. I do think we need a stronger approach, and happy at the moment to go along with the state's requirement, but when it gets down further to specific relations of what we should put in the planning scheme, I don't really think today I have the information to say what specific things I think should be in the planning scheme, but certainly support the recommendations of going with the state government's requirements and a stronger regulatory approach under the planning scheme. Thanks.
Yep. Councillor Rebecca. Councillor Nancy.
Nancy can go
Okay,
first.
thank you. I suppose what's rattling around in my mind is floods, although every flood is different, can be more defined than a fire can be.
Yes.
And it concerns me that we're trying to do similar with fire that we did with the flood. And our flood mapping is really good.
Yes.
I do believe it's good quality mapping.
It is.
But fire is a totally different ball game, and I just worry that we're adding an extra layer of red tape to our already overburdened. If you ask anybody in business, what's your first issue, whether it be council or state government, the first thing they say is red tape. And so I just worry that we are adding another layer of caution. It's a bit like putting a plug in a PowerPoint so a kid doesn't put his hand in his finger in the PowerPoint. I do worry that we do overdo that. And I look at the analysis which said climate influences may generate increased likelihood of fire into the future. So the first thing I thought when I read that was, well, what if it doesn't? What if it doesn't increase the likelihood, if the increase doesn't happen? Are we putting this extra layer on that's going to burden people more and restrict people's ability to do stuff on the potential that it may? So that worries me. And a development comes to mind which was on Prince Henry Heights, which we dealt with not that long ago. And that comes to my mind now, and I was thinking, well, if I had a big block of land up there on Prince Henry Heights and we introduced this, would it get approved? A big investment if you're buying a big block of land at Prince Henry Heights. And you've got it sitting there, and it says in this paperwork that there's no reimbursement if, due to this policy being in place. Oh,
Sorry, Councillor Summerfield. Yeah, sorry, Councillor. Sorry to interrupt, but Mayor, probably if we're going to talk specifically around Prince Henry Heights, things we've said in the past due to my
Understand that.
Where
I don't think Councillor Summerfield is doing anything other than... rhetorical
No, yeah,
question.
I just thought I agree with that, but I just thought I'd flag that. So if there's any detailed discussion around that actual development, I would obviously like to ask if we just...
Yeah.
Mr Chair,
If
could
you
I
want
just
to test
have...
the meeting, I'm happy to test the meeting. But in terms of that, I think Councillor Summerfield was just using that as
I'm
an
happy to
example.
talk broadly. Yeah.
Mr Chair, can I just ask a question, please? We have those areas that we're talking about, they're already under a fire overlay, aren't they?
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So just clarifying that if I could, because they went through a lot of agony over the fire side of,
May I just make...
would it be increased?
There
That's
is
what I need to
currently... There's currently overlays, fire overlays and controls in place. There are various developments around the place that have been in a situation that has faced fire hazard, and there's mention before about the quality of fire reports that councils get as part of DAs generally, and yes, they could be a lot better, and in that case, the first fire report, well, in a number of cases, the fire reports have been of a very poor quality, but due to officers following up and asking for specific details, those reports have been improved, and mitigation approaches and designs have been put in to assist in protecting those properties from future fire hazard.
Thanks, Stuart. So the clarity I would like now is if whatever this looks like moving forward in the planning scheme, would that make it even more difficult to do a development on the escarpment?
If you use the...
Well, one would hope that the new mapping, which we're talking about today, would give a better informed view in the circumstances.
Which...
I think that's an appropriate answer.
That, I hope, is what we're seeing here today, a more complete and a more exact study, and that will then inform.
Which has the potential to restrict further development along the escarpment.
Well, it may do, depending
Better
on
than people
how it
running in
works.
their beds.
The inappropriate developments that are identified as not being appropriate in fire hazard environments, but what it will do is just strengthen council's hand to make sure that either an inappropriate development doesn't take place in a fire hazard, or if a development does, that it's adequately protected through mechanisms other than just the building regulations. One of the things that happens when we indicate fire hazard ratings is that it enables the building regulations to kick in and require certain building requirements where there is a fire hazard. And that certainly increases the cost of building, but it also reduces the cost for the community overall when houses don't burn down.
Councillor Von Hoff, you are next in line.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Stuart. Stuart, the recommendation that's before us today is in 3 parts.
Get back to the recommendation.
I got it right here in front of you.
And,
Do you want it?
and
Councillor
the
recommendation.
point of today's meeting is to provide a direction for future steps. Now, can you please tell us if today as a council we felt that we just had some unformed questions still, or we felt a bit rushed considering the magnitude of this, and we didn't support the recommendations, what then would be the next steps for your department and for Meridian in their body of work, please?
Okay. Are you talking about those ABC
Correct.
recommendations?
Yes.
Because they're fairly open.
But if we felt that there's these unformed questions that just we haven't got there yet, or if we
That's
feel
right.
rushed and we feel any of those, and we just say let's slow this down. What would be, if we didn't support these recommendations, what then would that signal to your department and Meridian for their next steps?
if you didn't support it, we'd probably have a struggle because these are fairly general, the ABC, but the 5 questions, are the 5 questions you had? I think if we deal with the 5 questions as being reasonable questions to be answered through additional information to be provided to council, and we're not seeking an answer from council today on those 5 questions because they're not the recommendations. The actual recommendation for today is ABC. Development is supported in areas of bushfire risk where the risk is tolerable or where the risk can be reduced to a tolerable level. Now, to arrive at understanding what's tolerable and what's not requires more information, and that information will be provided to council as part of documents, part of additional mapping, more accurate mapping, and provisions in the scheme. B was development is avoided in areas of bushfire risk where the risk cannot be reduced to a tolerable level. It seems commonsensical. I mean, if council wasn't to adopt these, then we probably
nothing in there
wouldn't have anywhere to go.
So Stuart, if we didn't agree with this, would that mean that this body of work would grind to a halt?
I'm not sure where we would go. I maybe is in a better position than I am to answer that, but in my opinion,
if that's the case, then then I question the position of the council because.
Well, begging the question. See, these recommendations are begging the further information that has come forward because it's what's tolerable and what's not. What's intolerable, what's tolerable. We haven't brought to you today a clear indication of areas where there may in fact be an intolerability for particular uses. Sorry.
So there's nothing in there that we could miss.
I think those recommendations are very, very general and enable us to continue on that journey of tolerable and intolerable. And I guess all we're saying to you is that terminology, which is one that the state government has given to us, I think, is that the direction in which council wants to go? You know, and we will provide further information to council on how we measure tolerable and intolerable, and council will ultimately make a decision on that.
I made that comment about half an hour ago.
With respect, Stuart, that actually isn't the recommendation that's before us. It is specific that, in the first instance, just to say that development is supported where the risk is tolerable. I mean, it is specific. It's not open-ended, as you've been stating.
You're right, but it's what's tolerable and what's intolerable. See,
but we don't have that information. But here, this recommendation is that we are supporting development in areas where the risk is tolerable. The recommendations before us, they don't go into, we need to flesh out the definitions of what we deem to be tolerable and intolerable. This is a position.
Yep, that's correct, and it's in the context that drafting of bushfire policy and provisions, not the draft, but that drafting of bushfire policy and provisions in the new are based on the following principles.
Oh, that makes a difference.
Adopt those principles, basically.
Yeah.
Now, if you're unwilling to adopt those principles, we're going to have to come back with some new principles, and I'm not sure where we're going to get those from.
Okay, thank you.
That's the only problem.
But I think that makes, sorry, Mr Chair, I think that makes sense when you read it in the context that on the following principles. It's not saying that we're supporting, that's the principle is that we would, and when we get more information, then we can go through.
In broad terms, it may be about us getting all the information on the table to get it right.
Absolutely.
I might be missing something, but that's the way I see it. Councillor James, you were next, and then Councillor Nancy, you've indicated wish to say some more. Councillor James.
Thank you. Thanks, Mayor. I understand the point I think that the Councillor Von Hoff's raising, I suppose, because it's around that determination, as you said, around tolerable, vulnerable, and all those sort of things. And I think, yes, as a principle, as a generalisation, I think it's like saying that we support where the risk of flood or whatever is tolerable and things like that. So I get that, but I think it's the next step with this for me, and the part that keeps coming back for me, is around how the determination of through a planning scheme, I suppose, or a measure that we have in place around how we, I guess, mitigate the risk of some of these different areas. So just when I flick through it, I mean, I know we look at that, what was it, the ALARP gauge of risking vulnerability. On the summary of feedback, when we've got a desire for policy approach to avoid vulnerable uses in bushfire-prone areas. And then when we go to the recommendations that you had up there before, just around development involving vulnerable uses is ideally avoided in all areas of bushfire risk. Like, to me, thinking of some of the examples of things that we've had in the past with other things around DAs and that one I think it's really important, because those words don't say no. And if I'm a developer, I'm looking at doing something there, it's okay, I need to demonstrate how I can mitigate that risk to a tolerable level. And if I believe that I can do that and I present that to council, and then it's still, you know what I mean, it creates that extra step in place of with P&E courts and things like that. So I think it comes down to just how or what this council's view through a planning scheme around vulnerable uses at all in a bushfire risk area. If something can't be made reduced to a tolerable level, for us to say that we want to have that use avoided is pretty grey. Do you know what I mean? Like, I know you always say planning's not black and white, but to that it really opens the door of, you know, well, it just opens the door completely, and it's not quite clear. There's an intent, but how that stands up if someone comes in and says, yep, this is how we can mitigate the risk, this is our report A, B, C, D, this is the engineering report on that, and that. Council goes through, disagrees with that, knocks back, we go through, you know, things like that. I think that's one of the areas to me that we look at avoiding risk and how we move forward with this is a really key part. Probably comment, but...
Brian wishes to make a comment. And then we'll go to Megan.
Councillors, I'm suggesting you might want to consider a slight change to that wording along the lines of, it's been kicked out, that a proposed bushfire policy and provisions in the new planning scheme be further considered by council after a draft is prepared based on the following principles.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.
Much happier.
Two nods around the table?
Yep.
Yes.
So, in that case, Megan, if we can get that one prepared for when we come out of, when we suspend out of where we are now. Megan, you wish to make a few comments?
Oh, I suppose, Mr Mayor, that's probably in some ways alleviated people's concerns. I suppose I just wanted to say to councillors that, I mean, we remember what it was like when we had the bushfires, and I think everyone has a desire to do something, you know, to say, how could any council let those people live where they live or develop that block of land, you know, like, and that was really scary, and everyone was sort of saying, you know, we should do something. This is our opportunity to do something. And I sort of think, I believe that it behoves us as a council to take that as leaders to do all we can. And what we can do is strengthen it up through the planning scheme. So.
Can't disagree with that.
Councillor Nancy?
Yeah, thank you. I think I agree with you, Councillor Megan, wholeheartedly, but I think it's more than that. I think it's about fuel reduction, and it's about educating people.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, it's bigger than just the planning scheme. It's much bigger. It's about getting that fuel reduction. And, you know, it's broadly across Australia, it's been said, fuel reduction is key to reducing these significant fires that we're having. It's just black and white, that's what needs to be done. But also educating people about property management around fuel reduction.
Yep, absolutely. Look, that's a point that needs to be made. It's probably not specific in here, but it's certainly complementary to how we would manage fire. And of course, Laura, we're doing a lot of work here and generated out of this room working with our Indigenous people in this area about control burns, not only right here, but I know they're being used as a land management tool in some of the western areas here. So, I think that's good. Now, Councillor Shine, you had your hand up, and if anyone else wishes to speak before we reinstate standing orders, that'll be fine.
Just a thought that the subject matter is similar to flooding in the sense where Councillor O'Hara-Sullivan mentioned criticism of councils, why were people allowed to build here? That criticism has been made repeatedly of recent times over flooding, where in particular around Ipswich, I think, in those places, you see new subdivisions were allowed and covered with water. Likewise, if we have a state policy which, in simple terms, enables us or requires us really to examine and to implement a policy of prevention of building in areas where a high bushfire risk, and we ignore that, in the normal course you would think that we would be liable for our negligence in not implementing required policy. I suppose my question is, are we aware of any councils being in the firing line in terms of being sued or class actions, for example, since the Black Sunday,
Saturday.
whatever it was, 2009, or any other time? Because if it hasn't happened, I'm sure it will.
I'm not aware of any local government that has had legal action brought against it. That is not to say that that hasn't been the case, but I'm not aware, at least in relation to land use planning policy. There may have been instances where ignitions occurred and local government was part of legal action in those situations. But not in relation to a planning context, although I can't guarantee that, but my knowledge is no.
Okay, it might be that would be helpful for us to get some advice on that in deciding what direction we're going to go.
Okay, Councillor Vonhoff.
One last one, thank you, Mr. Chair, which is that, the 2019-20 fires around New South Wales, ACT and Victoria are recent enough that perhaps any changes to planning codes and things haven't been fleshed out fully. But I would have thought that for Victoria and the Black Saturday fires, being 2009, a sufficient amount of time has passed that, and I know that I've read things about the bunkers and the bowel builds and all of this sort of thing. They've lived it, they've learned from it, they've implemented policy and are continuing on their merry ways. And it would be helpful potentially for us to understand what have other areas done in this space, so that we can have a really good understanding, and when we're not sort of out on a limb by ourselves, we just have an understanding of the context. This is the eastern seaboard of Australia. Fire is very sadly known to us, and if we could just have some information included, perhaps as an attachment when this comes back, that this is what happened in these places from a local government, similar to what Councillor Shine was saying. This is the legal perspective, and this is the, the planning, the historical planning perspective, that might provide some context that would be helpful.
Yep, okay. And I'd imagine there'd be a reporting of the progress of all this on a regular basis, and whether you wanted that included in the resolution, or whether you wanted that to be just simply happening as a result of the work that Megan and Bill will be doing with the GM and the staff.
Oh, I'd like to be kept abreast of it.
Sorry, Councillor Kay.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I'd actually like for us to be kept informed about it.
Yeah, and I'm sure we will.
I might say that, Councillor Shine's, councils, local government's ability, except for our fire overlay, has been fairly limited as it was with flood to be able to refuse things. So we're moving now to an area, and I guess that's why we're doing this like we did with the flood mapping, so that we are in a position through our planning schemes where we can discourage or knock back development that's inappropriate for the area. So I think for that, we need to embrace it, because in previous years, we've always copped the blame for it and hadn't had the power to be able to do anything to stop it. But we're moving to a place now where we will be able to have some say on it if we've got our if we've got our maps and different things in a row, and that's the, we've done it with the flooding to a point, and now we're moving into it with the bushfires, and I think that's a good thing, not just for our for people to know where they should be and where they shouldn't be. If it's down there on a map, then they know.
Thanks, Councillor Carroll. Laura, would you like to just tidy? You had one more point that you were going to make. Is that necessary to do that?
Oh, no, my only comment was in response to one of the comments around the complexities of mirroring the approach to flood within the planning scheme. I think just to comment on that, it's probably only for certain aspects, because whilst there are similarities, there's also stark differences. So it's only in relation to a very small number of things. And the definition of vulnerable use as being one of those.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Any further questions? It's been a very complete and a very in-depth presentation, and we're very thankful for that, Laura. You've brought on quite a few questions. And do you wish to move on with the process, councillors?
Yep.
We'd like to move. We
come out of standing orders.
Reinstate standing orders. Councillor Carroll mentioned that. Councillor Tim has seconded that. Those in favour? Recommendation, councillors, is before you. I'll get Wendy to get that up now with the added provision there at the start that councils that a proposed bushfire policy and provisions in the new planning scheme be further considered by council after a draft is prepared based on the following principles. And those three principles have been well spoken of and been well discussed. Councillor Megan, you're moving. Councillor Megan has moved. Councillor McDonald has seconded. Those in favour? I didn't ask whether there's any debate, but anyhow. Any debate?
I think we've had it.
I think we've had it. That's okay. Those in favour? Motion's carried without dissent. Thanks very much, and thanks, Laura and Julia and Julie.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, councillors.
Very in-depth discussion. Thanks to our staff, and thanks to those people online who've continued to watch the whole thing as it's gone out. But I thank you, councillors, for asking the questions you have to make absolutely sure that we're on the right path. Thank you very much. The meeting's closed.